The Californian sun burned brightly that afternoon, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek. It was a peaceful town where people greeted each other with smiles and everyone knew one another's business. But on that day, the peace was shattered. Inside a modest two-story home at the end of Elmwood Drive, a tragedy was unfolding. Pastor Daniel Harris sat in the living room, his face tense with worry. His wife, Leah, had just given birth to their twins a month ago. The babies, a boy and a girl, were their pride and joy, their future. But today, something was different. Something had gone terribly wrong. Leah had been unwell for the past few days, but it wasn't until she took the twins for their routine checkup that they received the news. Both babies had sickle cell disease. The diagnosis hit Daniel like a ton of bricks. Sickle cell anemia was a condition that caused red blood cells to become sickle-shaped, leading to pain, fatigue, and, over time, severe complications. It was a hereditary disease that affected people of African descent, and Leah, though white, had carried the gene. Daniel had never even considered the possibility that he could be a carrier, and yet here they were. The doctor had explained the condition to them in detail. The babies would need frequent medical attention, and their lives would be marked by constant hospital visits and treatments. The weight of this news crushed Daniel's spirit. He couldn't fathom how he was going to deal with it. In his mind, the future he had envisioned for his family, the perfect life, was slipping away, replaced by a dark, uncertain path. Leah, however, remained calm. She had always been the strong one in their relationship, the one who held everything together. She reassured Daniel that they would get through it, that they would find a way to manage. But Daniel wasn't so sure. The thought of his children suffering, of his family's future in jeopardy, sent him into a spiraling depression. That night, as they sat in the dimly lit living room, Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about the twins' condition. He watched Leah as she fed one of the babies, her face full of love and tenderness. She had no idea what was brewing in his mind, but something inside him snapped. He wasn't prepared for this. He had always believed in the power of prayer, in the promise of a bright future. But now, as he looked at the babies, he saw only pain and suffering. He began to wonder, was this a test of his faith? Was this some kind of divine punishment? His thoughts grew darker, more irrational. Leah noticed the change in him. She had seen him go through rough patches before, but this felt different. Daniel was distant, lost in his own mind. She tried to talk to him, to comfort him, but he couldn't hear her. The voices in his head were too loud, too overwhelming. As the night wore on, Daniel's frustration turned to anger. Anger at the situation, at himself, at the world. He felt helpless, trapped. He couldn't bear the thought of his children living a life of pain. And he couldn't bear the thought of Leah, his beloved wife, suffering alongside them. In the early hours of the morning, a terrible thought crossed Daniel's mind. What if the only way to end their suffering was to end it all? What if there was a way to take control of their fate, to put an end to the pain before it even began? He shook his head, trying to push the thought away, but it lingered. He couldn't let go of the idea. It began to consume him, poisoning his thoughts, distorting his sense of right and wrong. The twins, meanwhile, slept peacefully in their cribs, unaware of the storm that was brewing just steps away from them. Leah, exhausted from the long day, fell asleep on the couch, the baby in her arms. Daniel watched her, his heart torn. He loved her. He loved the children. But the pain, the fear, the uncertainty, it was too much. As the hours passed, Daniel found himself standing in the doorway of the nursery, staring at the cribs. His heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure how much time passed. All he knew was that the idea had taken root. The darkness in his mind had grown too strong to ignore. He stepped forward, each movement deliberate, and in the silence of the night, he made a choice. The morning light filtered through the curtains of the Harris household, casting a soft glow on the scene of destruction that had unfolded overnight. Leah, exhausted from the weight of motherhood and the recent diagnosis of their twins, had fallen into a deep sleep on the couch. She cradled one of the babies in her arms, while the other slept soundly in the crib across the room. The air was still, a sense of normalcy lingering in the home despite the darkness that had descended just hours before. But Daniel had no peace. His mind was a whirlwind of chaos, his thoughts drowning out any reason or logic. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. With slow, deliberate movements, he approached the crib where the twins lay. His heart pounded in his chest as his gaze shifted between the two small faces, so innocent, so unaware of the fate that awaited them. His hand trembled as he reached for the baby boy, lifting him gently out of the crib. The child let out a soft whimper but didn't wake, his tiny body limp in Daniel's arms. Daniel's breathing grew shallow, the air thick with the tension of his actions. He stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing as he processed what he was about to do. The baby boy, so small and fragile, seemed to weigh nothing in his arms. His innocence was a stark contrast to the darkness that Daniel felt inside. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, lost in the moment, but it felt like an eternity. He knew that the path he had chosen could not be undone. The baby stirred slightly, and Daniel's grip tightened. He could hear Leah's soft breathing from across the room, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding. She was still deep in sleep, the exhaustion of the past month taking its toll on her. For a fleeting moment, Daniel felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly drowned out by the overwhelming sense of finality that consumed him. He walked toward the kitchen, the baby still in his arms. His hands shook, and his mind raced as he prepared to take the next step. The thoughts in his head were like a storm, violent, chaotic, and uncontrollable. The whispers told him that this was the only way, that the pain, the suffering, would be over once and for all. As he entered the kitchen, his eyes fell on the bottle of sleeping pills that Leah had left on the counter. She had been struggling with insomnia ever since the birth, unable to get a good night's sleep due to the constant worry about the twins' health. The pills were meant to help her rest, to calm her nerves. But now in Daniel's twisted mind, they had become an instrument of his plan. He moved quickly, crushing a few pills into the baby's bottle, making sure it was dissolved completely. His hands were clammy, his thoughts clouded. He knew what he was doing, but it didn't feel real. It felt like someone else was controlling his body, leading him down this dark path. With the bottle in hand, he returned to the living room, where Leah still slept soundly. The baby boy lay peacefully in his arms, unaware of the danger. As he approached the couch, his gaze lingered on his wife, her face soft with sleep, the lines of worry fading for just a moment. He had always loved her, always admired her strength, but now all he felt was a cold emptiness. He sat down next to her, his hands shaking as he carefully placed the bottle in front of the baby's mouth. He tried to steady himself, tried to focus on the task at hand, but his mind was a blur. The darkness had taken over, and he couldn't see beyond it. The baby's tiny lips latched onto the bottle, and Daniel watched as the child drank slowly, the liquid passing through his small body. He felt a cold chill run through him, but he didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the child, on the helplessness of it all. It was happening. There was no turning back now. Minutes passed in silence. The baby finished the bottle, and Daniel placed it gently back on the table. He sat there for a long moment, the weight of his actions crashing over him. But the guilt didn't come. Instead, he felt a strange sense of relief, as if a burden had been lifted. The babies would no longer suffer. He had ended it, but his work was far from done. The baby girl lay in her crib across the room, unaware of the tragedy that had just unfolded. Daniel stood up and walked toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear Leah shifting on the couch behind him, but he didn't look back. He had made his decision. He couldn't let her stop him now. As he approached the crib, his breath quickened. The baby girl lay on her back, her small chest rising and falling with each breath. She looked so peaceful, so innocent. But to Daniel, she was part of the same fate. He couldn't let her live with this condition. He couldn't bear the thought of them suffering, of the pain that would follow. Without hesitation, he lifted her from the crib, holding her against his chest. She let out a small whimper but didn't wake. He moved back to the kitchen, where the pills were still scattered across the counter. This time he didn't need the bottle. He would end it quickly. He crushed the remaining pills and mixed them with water, his hands working quickly and efficiently. He returned to the living room, where Leah was still asleep, unaware of what was happening. As he bent down to give the baby girl the mixture, he caught sight of the clock on the wall. It was almost time for the morning service at the church. He had to finish this before anyone came looking for them. The baby girl drank from the spoon, her tiny body trembling slightly as she swallowed the liquid. Daniel felt a strange calm wash over him, as though everything was falling into place. He had made his choice, and now there would be peace. No suffering, no pain. As the twins' breathing slowed and their tiny bodies grew still, Daniel finally allowed himself to take a breath. He looked over at Leah, still asleep, and felt a wave of sorrow. But there was no turning back now. There would be no more hospital visits, no more pain. The suffering had ended. He left the babies on the couch and turned to face the door. The clock was ticking. He needed to act fast. The morning came and went like a quiet breeze. The events that unfolded inside the Harris household hidden beneath the surface. The sun hung lazily in the sky as the early hours passed, untouched by the storm that had just ravaged one family's life. But that tranquility wouldn't last. There was no escaping the consequences of the actions that had been set into motion the night before. It was 11 a.m. when the phone rang in the Harris household. The deep silence inside the home had been broken only by the occasional creaks of the house settling, the sound of a bird chirping outside the window, or the soft rustle of the trees as the wind blew through the yard. Everything appeared perfectly normal from the outside, but inside the air was thick with death. Daniel had already cleaned up his tracks. He had placed the twins' tiny bodies carefully back in their cribs, making it seem as though they had simply fallen asleep. Leah remained on the couch, still as serene as ever, her face free from the worry and fear that would never trouble her again. Daniel stood in the living room, his mind clouded with a strange detachment, as though he were watching someone else's life unfold. He had done what needed to be done, and now there was nothing left to do but wait. But the call shattered his silence. It was Sarah, a close friend of Leah's from the church. She had been expecting to drop by and help with the babies, as she had promised Leah earlier that week. She was concerned, though. She hadn't heard from Leah all morning and wanted to check in. Daniel's pulse quickened as he heard her voice over the phone, her words cutting through the fog in his mind. "Daniel, is everything okay? Leah hasn't responded to my messages, and I haven't heard from her all morning. I was hoping to come by and help with the babies today. Should I just head over now?" Sarah's voice was warm, friendly, filled with the innocence of someone who had no idea of the horror lying just behind the walls of the Harris home. Daniel's heart raced as he processed the question. He had known Sarah for years. She was a good woman, one of the church members who truly cared for Leah. His instincts screamed at him to lie, to tell Sarah everything was fine. But the weight of his actions made it hard to think clearly. He had to stay calm. He had to stay in control. "Everything's fine, Sarah," Daniel said, forcing his voice to sound normal, even though the words felt foreign in his mouth. "Leah's just resting. The babies are asleep, and we're all fine here. Thank you for checking in, though. We'll talk later, okay?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Daniel could feel the tension building. Sarah wasn't convinced. She knew Leah well enough to recognize when something wasn't right. "I understand, but are you sure you're okay?" Sarah's tone softened, as if sensing that something was off. "You sound distant. I just want to make sure everything is good. I can come by to help if you need anything, Daniel." He swallowed hard, his throat dry, but he couldn't afford to let anything slip. He was in control. He had to be. "I'm fine, Sarah. Really," Daniel repeated, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. "We're just taking it easy today. It's been a long week." There was another silence, but Sarah finally relented. "Okay, if you say so. But please don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. You know I'm here for you." "Thanks, I appreciate it," Daniel replied quickly, hanging up before she could say more. He stared at the phone for a moment, then turned it off completely, his hands shaking as he did. His head was swimming, the guilt and the unease clawing at him. He had barely managed to lie convincingly, and Sarah's concern had stirred something in him, a moment of vulnerability that felt almost unbearable. But it wasn't over. He had done what he had to do, and now he needed to stick to the story. Sarah, meanwhile, sat in her car in the church parking lot, staring at her phone with a confused frown. Something felt wrong. She had known Daniel and Leah long enough to understand when something was amiss, and she had a gut feeling that this wasn't just a quiet day at home. Still, Sarah tried to push her worries aside. Daniel's words seemed convincing enough, but the unease in her stomach wouldn't go away. She decided to call her husband Mark, who was a local police officer, just to ease her mind. It was better to be cautious than to ignore her instincts. "Hey Mark, it's me. I just got off the phone with Daniel. He seemed off. I don't know, just strange. Leah hasn't been answering her phone, and he said everything was fine, but I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong. Can you swing by their house just to check in?" Sarah's voice was tight with concern as she spoke. Mark, having worked in law enforcement for years, understood the importance of listening to gut feelings. He immediately agreed, reassuring her that he would go by the Harris home to make sure everything was okay. He, too, had known Daniel for years, and he didn't like the tone Sarah had described. It wasn't long before Mark arrived at the Harris house. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed the strange stillness of the house. There were no sounds from inside, no movement behind the curtains, no sign of the usual bustle that came with a young family at home. He knocked at the door, but there was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Still, no one responded. His instincts kicked in. Something didn't feel right. Mark reached for his phone and dialed 911. "I'm at a friend's house and there's something off. No one's answering the door, and I've got a bad feeling about this. Can you send someone to check it out?" Within minutes, the police arrived, and Mark made his way around the side of the house to check the back door. It was unlocked. Without waiting for backup, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of birds outside. Mark called out, his voice echoing through the empty space, but there was no response. The tension in the air was palpable, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He had been in many homes like this before, but there was something about this one that felt different. As he moved through the house, he finally found Leah, lying lifeless on the couch, the baby boy still cradled in her arms. The scene was more disturbing than Mark could have ever imagined. His heart raced as he stepped closer to the couch, realizing that the baby was cold, unresponsive. He quickly checked for signs of life, but there was nothing. Then he moved toward the baby's room, where he found the other child, lifeless in the crib, the small body still as stone. In that moment, Mark knew the worst had happened. He called for backup immediately, his voice urgent, his mind reeling. The horror of what he had just discovered hit him like a freight train. The calm of Willow Creek was shattered as the morning's tragic discovery sent ripples through the small, tight-knit community. Within hours, the police had cordoned off the Harris residence, and a steady stream of officers, detectives, and forensic experts began combing through the home. The serene suburban streets, which had once been filled with the laughter of children and the warm greetings of neighbors, now buzzed with the quiet hum of law enforcement. The tragedy that had unfolded behind the closed doors of the Harris home was too shocking for words. Detective Emma Hayes arrived at the scene shortly after the initial discovery. A seasoned investigator in her late 30s, Emma had worked in homicide for over 10 years, and her sharp intuition had led her to solve many of the most difficult cases in her career. She had seen death in many forms, but there was something about this case that seemed to claw at her insides. The deaths of two innocent children, the apparent murder of a mother, and the disturbing lack of evidence. It was a puzzle, and she was determined to solve it. As she stepped out of her car, she observed the scene before her. The house was cordoned off, and officers stood watch as forensic technicians carefully collected evidence. A sense of urgency hung in the air. The community was in shock, but Emma knew that the clock was ticking. The longer they waited, the harder it would be to find answers. She made her way to the front door, where Sergeant Daniels met her. His face was grim, and he led her inside, past the crowd of officers and forensic teams. The smell of disinfectant and bleach was overpowering, a sign that someone had tried to clean the scene, or at least cover up some of the details. But Emma was no stranger to crime scenes, and she could sense that there was more to this than met the eye. "Detective Hayes," Sergeant Daniels greeted her, his voice low. "The bodies of Leah and the twins have been found. No signs of forced entry, no obvious wounds. It looks like the victims were poisoned. At least that's the theory we're working with right now. The twins are both under a year old, and Leah, well, it doesn't look good." Emma nodded and took in the scene around her. her sharp eyes scanning every detail. She approached the living room, where Leah's body was still lying on the couch. The baby boy was in her arms, and both were cold to the touch. The baby girl, too, was found lifeless in her crib in the adjacent room. "Did you find anything that could point to how they died?" Emma asked, keeping her tone steady. Sergeant Daniels shook his head. "There's no sign of trauma, no wounds, no bruises. The medical examiner's team is still working, but we suspect poisoning. We found traces of something in the twins' bottles, possibly some kind of sedative or sleeping pill. We're waiting for the toxicology reports to confirm." Emma's brow furrowed. Who would do something like this? And why? Sergeant Daniels didn't have an answer, and Emma knew that she had to approach the case from every angle. She would have to dig deeper into the lives of the Harris family, search for any clues that might explain what led to this unimaginable tragedy. The forensics team had already begun their work, and Emma turned her attention to Leah's personal belongings. She searched through the family's home, going through the kitchen, the nursery, and the living room. There was nothing overtly suspicious. No broken items, no signs of a struggle. But Emma knew that sometimes the smallest details could lead to the biggest breakthroughs. She moved into the office, where she noticed a small stack of papers on the desk. The papers were mostly bills and church-related documents, but one envelope caught her attention. It was addressed to Leah, but it appeared unopened. She picked it up and examined it closely. The return address was from a medical clinic, one that specialized in genetic testing. A chill ran down Emma's spine. Could this be related to the twins' illness? She opened the envelope carefully, revealing a test result. It was a blood test report confirming that both of the Harris twins had been diagnosed with sickle cell anemia. Leah had received this news recently, and Emma wondered if the diagnosis had triggered something in Daniel, something that led to this senseless act of violence. Emma took the report with her and moved back into the living room, where the forensic team had finished processing the area around Leah and the babies. She briefly spoke with the medical examiner, who had completed an initial examination of the bodies. "Detective, it's as we suspected," the examiner said. "The twins both show signs of poisoning. There's also evidence of a sedative in their systems. As for Leah, the cause of death appears to be asphyxiation. She was likely smothered or suffocated. We're still waiting for full autopsy results, but that's the preliminary finding." Emma's heart sank. The details were coming together, but they still didn't make sense. Why would someone want to kill their own family? What kind of monster could do this? And why did Leah die differently than the babies? The question gnawed at Emma, and she was determined to find the answers. Back at the police station, Emma began compiling a timeline of events. She interviewed neighbors and friends who had known the Harris family, piecing together details of their lives. The Harris family appeared to be well-liked, with no outward signs of trouble. Daniel was a well-respected pastor at the local church, known for his charisma and devotion to his faith. Leah, his wife, was active in the church's community outreach programs, often volunteering for charity work. But there were hints that things weren't as perfect as they appeared. Some neighbors recalled that Daniel had become withdrawn in the days leading up to the deaths. He had been acting strangely, avoiding people, barely speaking to anyone. One neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, recalled seeing him late one night, sitting in his car in front of the house, staring blankly ahead. He looked lost, like he was struggling with something. Emma's mind raced as she took note of these inconsistencies. What had changed? Why had Daniel been so distant? And what had driven him to such an extreme act? She decided it was time to speak with Daniel himself. At the Harris residence, Daniel was sitting in the kitchen when Emma and Sergeant Daniels arrived. He was calm, almost eerily so. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but he showed no outward signs of panic. It was as if the tragedy hadn't affected him the way it should have. "Mr. Harris," Emma began, her voice firm but empathetic, "we need to ask you some questions. Can you tell us what happened?" Daniel's eyes flickered briefly, but he remained silent for a long moment. Then slowly he spoke. "I don't know. I found them," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Leah and the babies. They were gone. I don't know what happened. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. They were just Gone. Emma studied him closely, noting his lack of emotion. He wasn't crying. He wasn't showing the kind of grief she would have expected from a father who had just lost everything. I know this is difficult, Daniel, but we need you to walk us through the past few days. What's been going on with you and your family? Daniel paused, his eyes drifting toward the floor. The babies, they were sick. The doctors said they had sickle cell. I didn't know what to do. I prayed and prayed, but it felt like everything was falling apart. And Leah, she was so strong, so hopeful, but I couldn't handle it. I couldn't take it. Emma's eyes narrowed as she listened. The stress of the diagnosis, the pressure of his faith, seemed to have taken its toll on Daniel. But could it have driven him to kill his own family? It didn't add up yet. Daniel, Emma continued, you understand that your wife and children are dead, right? And that someone took their lives. We need to know if you can help us understand how this happened. For the first time, Daniel's eyes flickered with something other than blankness. A flash of guilt, or maybe fear, crossed his face. But he quickly masked it with a look of resignation. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't bear seeing them suffer. It felt like a test, like a punishment from God. I didn't know how to fix it, so I thought it would be better this way. I thought it would end their pain. Emma's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't some random tragedy. Daniel Harris had murdered his family, and now the full scope of his actions was beginning to reveal itself. The quiet, subdued atmosphere in the police interrogation room contrasted sharply with the storm brewing inside Emma's mind. As she sat across from Daniel Harris, watching him squirm in his chair, the weight of the truth began to settle. Daniel had just admitted, albeit reluctantly, to what Emma had feared all along. He had killed his wife and children. But his admission, wrapped in a cloud of justifications and religious fervor, left Emma feeling as though she was just scratching the surface. The answers to the questions she needed to ask still lingered in the air. Daniel sat with his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his shoulders hunched as if he were trying to make himself as small as possible. His voice was low, hesitant as he spoke, but his words carried a disturbing clarity. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, Daniel murmured, his eyes fixed on the table. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought it would make things better. Emma's gaze never left him. The truth was right in front of her, but it still didn't make sense. Sickle cell anemia. The diagnosis had come only a month ago, a bitter blow to a family that had been already struggling with life's pressures. But to murder them over it? To end their lives because of a disease that was beyond anyone's control? She shook her head inwardly, not ready to process the depths of this tragedy yet. You thought it would make things better? Emma asked, her voice calm but laced with incredulity. How exactly did you think killing your family would solve anything? Daniel's eyes filled with a distant sadness, his voice cracking as he spoke. I thought I was saving them. I thought it would end their suffering before it started. The doctors told us the babies would suffer so much. They would be in and out of the hospital, hooked up to machines. Leah, she was so strong, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She was scared of what the future held for them. I thought, if I took them away from this world, they wouldn't have to suffer. They wouldn't feel the pain of this disease. Emma's stomach churned as the full weight of Daniel's words hit her. He wasn't justifying his actions with selfish motives. He was trying to rationalize them with his twisted sense of love and guilt. Daniel didn't just kill his wife and children because he was angry or frustrated. He killed them because, in his mind, he was sparing them from a future filled with pain. But that didn't excuse what he had done. That didn't erase the cold, deliberate nature of his actions. Daniel, Emma began, her voice steady, you do realize that this was not your choice to make, right? You can't play God. Your wife and children, they deserve to live. You didn't have the right to take that away from them, no matter what you thought. Daniel's face contorted, as if in pain from the realization, and he lowered his head, his voice barely audible. I thought it was the only way. I thought I was doing the right thing for them. The silence in the room thickened, and Emma leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Daniel's. Tell me what happened that night, she urged. How did you go from thinking you were helping them to actually taking their lives? Daniel shifted in his seat, his hands trembling slightly. He was clearly struggling to recall the events, as though they were too painful to relive, but he knew he had no choice but to answer. Emma's determination pressed him forward. "I had been up all night," Daniel began, his voice shaking with the effort of recounting the night's events. "I couldn't sleep. I was so scared. The babies, they cried so much. Leah, she was tired, but she wouldn't rest. She kept telling me it would be okay, that we'd manage, that we'd find a way to get through this. But I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was falling apart." He paused, and for a moment Emma could see the strain in his face. He was remembering, reliving the horror of that night, the horror he had caused. "I went into the kitchen," Daniel continued, his voice quieter now. "I looked at the medicine cabinet. I didn't want to hurt them, but I didn't know what else to do. I found some pills, sleeping pills. They were left over from when Leah had trouble sleeping a few months ago. I thought, I thought if I gave them to her and the babies, they'd fall asleep, peacefully, without pain. I could take them all away from this world, from their suffering." Emma's breath caught in her throat as she listened. It was worse than she had imagined. Daniel hadn't planned to kill them in a fit of rage. No, he had planned their deaths with a cold, methodical sense of mercy that wasn't mercy at all. "I crushed the pills," Daniel said, his voice now trembling. "I mixed them in with their milk. I thought they would just fall asleep, and then everything would end. It wasn't about me. It was about them. I thought they would be better off in heaven." The tears in his eyes weren't for the lives he had taken, but for the twisted belief that he had done something noble. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the full horror of Daniel's reasoning became clear. He hadn't just murdered his family. He had made an irreversible decision, thinking he was saving them from a future that scared him more than the thought of their deaths. "Then what happened?" Emma asked, her voice tight. Daniel's hands shook as he continued. "I gave them the bottles. I thought they would just fall asleep, quietly, but they didn't. The babies, oh God, the babies, something was wrong. They started choking. They couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do. Leah, she woke up and she started screaming. I tried to hold them, to help them, but it was too late. I panicked. I thought I could fix it, but I couldn't." He stopped, taking a shuddering breath, his eyes now flooded with guilt, regret, and fear. "I smothered Leah. I didn't want her to suffer too. She wouldn't stop crying, and I couldn't bear it. She wouldn't understand. She didn't know what I had done." Emma felt the coldness of his words sink into her bones. It wasn't a moment of uncontrolled rage that led Daniel to murder his family. No, it was a premeditated act, carried out with chilling conviction. He had believed that his actions were justified, that his love for them had somehow excused the act of ending their lives. "But you didn't just kill them," Emma said, her voice softer now, but filled with an undeniable conviction. "You tried to cover it up. You lied. You pretended everything was fine when Sarah called. You tried to make it seem like nothing had happened. You didn't want anyone to know the truth." Daniel's face paled even further. He wasn't prepared for the accusation, but deep down, Emma knew that she was right. He had tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy, even after he had ended the lives of those he was supposed to love and protect. "I didn't want anyone to know," Daniel whispered. "I couldn't face the truth. I couldn't let anyone think I was a monster." Emma leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had heard the truth, but the case wasn't over yet. There were still more questions to answer, still more to uncover. But for now, the truth had surfaced, and Daniel Harris's delusional justification for his horrific actions was out in the open. The following days were filled with the grim process of closing the case. Daniel was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder, one for each of his victims. His trial would be long, and his defense, based on his mental state and his twisted sense of mercy, would challenge the courts to grapple with the complex issues of mental health, parental love, and the sanctity of life. For Emma Hayes, though, the case left an indelible mark on her soul. No matter how many cases she solved, no matter how many criminals she brought to justice, there would always be the one case that haunted her, the one that felt like it left a part of her broken. This was that case. The people of Willow Creek would never forget the Harris family, the mother and father who were once pillars of the community. the beautiful twins whose lives were stolen. Routine. Emma could only wonder how long it would take for the wounds left behind by this tragic, senseless act to heal. The town of Willow Creek felt as though it had been suffocated by grief. The church that Daniel Harris once filled with his passionate sermons was now eerily silent. The members of his congregation, the people who had admired him as a leader of faith, found themselves struggling to understand how their beloved pastor could commit such an unspeakable crime. Daniel's trial loomed, and the community was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered trust. In the days following Daniel's confession, Detective Emma Hayes couldn't escape the mental image of the Harris family, the once vibrant couple and their twin babies, now forever frozen in tragedy. But her work wasn't finished. The trial was about to begin, and the evidence needed to be meticulously presented. Emma's job was not just to uncover the truth, it was now her duty to make sure justice was served. Daniel Harris stood in front of the courtroom, his hands clasped tightly together, his once confident demeanor now replaced with an air of defeat. His defense attorney, a sharp and calculating man named Richard Sutherland, stood by his side. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Miriam Lawson, was determined to see that Daniel was held accountable for his actions. The courtroom was filled with hushed whispers as the proceedings began. Emma sat in the back, her eyes focused on Daniel. She had never been a fan of the legal system. It wasn't the same as solving a case in the field, where you could see justice unfold right before your eyes. In the courtroom, it felt like everything was up for interpretation, subject to the strategies of lawyers and the sway of a jury. But she was determined to see this through. Daniel's crime could not be excused, no matter how much his defense team tried to portray him as a man broken by mental illness or divine intervention. The opening statement was delivered by District Attorney Lawson, her voice clear and commanding as she painted a stark picture for the jury. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what happened in the Harris household that fateful night was not a mercy killing. It was murder. The defendant, Daniel Harris, killed his wife, Leah, and their 1-month-old twin babies because he believed he was sparing them from a life of suffering. His actions were not those of a man in despair, but of a man who made a calculated, premeditated decision to take the lives of his own family. Emma watched as Lawson's words sunk in. The case against Daniel seemed straightforward, but Emma knew that the defense would fight hard. Richard Sutherland was known for his ability to manipulate the truth, to twist facts and exploit loopholes in the law. He would paint Daniel as a victim, an innocent man caught in a mental spiral, driven by the burden of his religious convictions and his overwhelming sense of guilt. Sutherland's opening statement did indeed take a different approach. He spoke with a tone of sympathy, as though Daniel were a man deserving of compassion rather than condemnation. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the prosecution's version of the events, but what they've left out is the crucial factor here: the defendant's mental state. Daniel Harris was not in his right mind when he killed his wife and children. He was a man overwhelmed by fear and guilt, tormented by the idea that his children would suffer. In his mind, this was an act of love, a final mercy for his family, not the horrific crime the prosecution would have you believe it was. We will show you that Daniel was suffering from severe mental distress and that his actions were not those of a sane man. Emma clenched her fists, fighting the frustration that threatened to rise within her. She knew that Sutherland would focus on the sickle cell diagnosis and Daniel's religious convictions as evidence of his distorted mindset. But that didn't change the facts. It didn't change the horror of what Daniel had done. The trial moved quickly. Both the prosecution and defense presented their evidence, each side making their case with carefully chosen words and expert testimony. Dr. Rachel Haynes, a forensic psychiatrist, took the stand for the defense. She was the one who had evaluated Daniel after his arrest, and she painted a picture of a man who had been pushed to the edge by the weight of his perceived moral responsibility. Daniel Harris was struggling with profound guilt, Dr. Haynes testified. He was consumed by the idea that he was somehow responsible for his children's fate. The sickle cell diagnosis was a breaking point for him. He was unable to accept that his children would suffer the way they were predicted to. He believed that, as their father, it was his duty to prevent that suffering, no matter the cost. Emma listened intently, her eyes narrowing. Dr. Haynes was speaking about Daniel's state of mind in the days leading up to the murders. But Emma knew that there was more to the story. Daniel's actions went beyond mental illness. They were the product of a deeply twisted belief system. He didn't just kill his family because he was afraid of their suffering. He killed them because he thought he had the right to make that decision. His faith, his interpretation of God's will, had led him down this dark path. Next, the prosecution called its own expert, Dr. Samuel Larkin, a renowned psychiatrist with a focus on criminal behavior. His testimony was direct and cutting. While I cannot discount that Daniel Harris may have been experiencing some level of emotional distress, the idea that he believed his actions were a form of mercy is, in my professional opinion, an excuse. What he did was not the result of a mental breakdown or an inability to discern right from wrong. It was an intentional act, premeditated and executed with a chilling clarity of purpose. Emma watched as Dr. Larkin's words resonated with the jury. It was clear that he wasn't buying the defense's argument. Daniel had killed his family because he thought he had the power to choose their fate. It wasn't a mercy killing, it was murder, plain and simple. The trial dragged on for weeks with witnesses called, evidence presented, and emotional testimonies given. Emma found herself revisiting the investigation, trying to make sense of every tiny detail, every piece of evidence that might sway the jury in favor of justice. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the case was handed over to the jury. The room was tense, with everyone holding their breath, waiting for the verdict. Emma sat in her seat, her hands folded in her lap, her mind running over the facts once more. She had seen the truth unfold before her eyes. Now it was in the hands of the jury to decide if Daniel Harris would be held accountable for his actions. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, Emma's heart raced. She watched as the foreman stood, a somber expression on his face. "Your Honor, we the jury find the defendant, Daniel Harris, guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder." The words hit Emma like a thunderclap. The relief that washed over her was immediate, but it was tempered by the sadness of what had been lost. The Harris family would never come back, and no verdict could change the horrific reality of their deaths. Daniel Harris was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were firm as he handed down the sentence. "Daniel Harris, your actions were both tragic and horrifying. The lives of your wife and children were cut short because of your misguided beliefs and your inability to see the value of their lives, regardless of their suffering. You will spend the rest of your days in prison, where you will have time to reflect on the irreversible damage you have caused." As the gavel fell, Emma stood in the back of the courtroom, watching the once pastor now led away in handcuffs. The man who had once stood at the pulpit, preaching about salvation and faith, was now a convicted murderer. He was just a man now, no different from any other criminal, but in his mind, he had done something righteous. In his mind, he had saved his family. Emma couldn't help but wonder, as the courtroom emptied and the case came to its conclusion, if Daniel Harris would ever truly understand the depth of his crime, or if he would continue to justify it until the end of his days. The truth had been uncovered, but the scars left behind would never fully heal. The sun set on Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the small town. The once peaceful streets now felt alien to Emma Hayes, a community irreparably altered by the horrors of the Harris family tragedy. She sat at her desk in the quiet of her office, the sound of her pen scratching on paper, the only noise in the otherwise still room. The case was officially closed, but Emma found herself revisiting it in her mind over and over again, unable to let go. The aftermath of the trial had not been kind to Daniel Harris. He was locked away in a high-security prison, far removed from the pulpit he had once stood behind with such conviction. The once well-respected pastor now lived in isolation, haunted by his actions, though Emma doubted he would ever truly comprehend the magnitude of the lives he had destroyed. He had killed his family to save them, or so he thought. But for Emma, the work was never over. She was a detective, but more than that, she was a human being, and that meant carrying the weight of every case she worked on, the losses, the victims, the families forever scarred. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she still hadn't learned from this case. As she leaned back in her chair, Emma closed her eyes and let her mind drift. It was hard not to think of Leah, her vibrant smile, her dreams of raising her children in the warmth of a close-knit family. It was hard not to think of those tiny babies, their lives cut short before they had even had the chance to know the world. The pain was raw, even now, months after the trial. In the weeks after the verdict, Emma made several trips to the Harris family home. It was no longer the place of worship it had once been. The church, now shuttered, sat in silence on the corner of Pine and Maple. Emma had spoken with a few of the parishioners in town, some who had stood by Daniel through thick and thin, and others who felt betrayed by the man who had led them with such fervor. Daniel's faith had been one of the driving forces behind the murders. His belief that he was acting in God's name, that he was performing a merciful act by ending the lives of his family, was what made his crime so unique. But it was also the most difficult part of the case to reconcile. How does a man who speaks of love and faith take the lives of his own children? How does someone so deeply immersed in religious teachings justify murder as an act of mercy? It was a question Emma had asked herself repeatedly. The more she dug into Daniel's past, the more complicated the answer seemed. He had grown up in a strict religious household, raised to believe in a rigid interpretation of Scripture. His father had been a pastor too, a man whose stern beliefs were often felt more as a punishment than a guidance. Daniel had never known a life outside the confines of his faith, and as he became an adult, that world only became more and more narrow. His fear of God's wrath, his desire to save others, had been twisted in a way that led him to murder. There was something deeply tragic in that, and it haunted Emma every time she thought of it. Daniel hadn't been driven by hate or malice. He had been driven by an overwhelming sense of duty, one that twisted and corrupted his ability to see right from wrong. His faith had consumed him in a way that made him incapable of seeing the value of life outside of his rigid, controlling lens. Emma's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She looked up to see Sarah, the young woman who had been one of Leah's closest friends, standing hesitantly in the doorway. Sarah had been one of the first to learn of the murders and had since become an advocate for justice in the aftermath. She had attended every day of the trial, sitting silently in the front row as Daniel's fate unfolded. "Detective Hayes," Sarah began, her voice soft but steady, "I just wanted to check in with you. I know the case is closed, but I don't think any of us have really been able to move on from what happened. It's still so hard to believe that Leah is gone, that the babies are gone." Emma gestured to the chair in front of her desk. "Come in, Sarah. Take a seat." Sarah entered the room and Emma could see the heaviness in her eyes. It was a weight that Sarah had carried since the moment she'd learned of Leah's death. The woman had been a part of Leah's life for years, and losing her in such a violent way left a permanent scar. "I don't think any of us will ever move on from this," Emma said quietly. "I don't think it's possible. Not for you, not for me. But I know you're asking because you want some kind of closure, right?" Sarah nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I keep asking myself why. Why did Daniel do this? How could he think this was the right thing to do? I mean, Leah was his wife. Those were his children. How could he do that to them?" Emma paused, thinking about her own feelings of confusion and frustration. "I've asked myself that same question, Sarah, over and over again. I think what makes it so hard to understand is that Daniel didn't see it as murder. He saw it as saving them. He believed in his own warped way that he was protecting his family from a life of suffering." Sarah shook her head, her voice rising with emotion. "But that wasn't his choice to make. It wasn't his right to decide who lives and who dies, not because of some disease. He didn't have the right to play God." Emma's heart ached for Sarah. It was the same feeling she had: anger, disbelief, and a deep sense of unfairness. But there was one thing she had come to realize during the investigation, something that Sarah was only now beginning to understand. "No, Sarah," Emma said softly. "He didn't have the right, and that's why what he did was so wrong. But sometimes people get so lost in their own fears, in their own beliefs, that they lose sight of what really matters. They lose sight of the fact that we don't have control over life and death. We only have the responsibility to cherish the time we have with the people we love." Sarah wiped a tear from her eye, nodding silently. She had been close to Leah, and the pain of losing her so suddenly was overwhelming. But Emma knew that as much as Sarah might want to understand the why behind the murder, some answers would never be enough. No one would ever be able to fix the emptiness left behind. The months passed and life in Willow Creek began to return to some semblance of normalcy. The town, though scarred by the tragedy, had slowly found a way to heal, at least outwardly. The church remained closed, a ghost of its former self, and the families who had once called the Harris household a place of spiritual refuge now struggled with the memory of what had unfolded there. Emma visited the site where the Harris home had stood, now an empty lot with only the foundation remaining. She closed her eyes, imagining the life that had once been there, the laughter of children, the warmth of family gatherings. It felt like a lifetime ago. The case had been closed, but the memory of the Harris family, of the beautiful twins whose lives had been stolen, would never fade. Emma had solved the case, had brought Daniel Harris to justice, but there would always be a part of her that carried the pain of that family's loss. As Emma sat back in her chair, staring at the empty lot through the office window, she realized that no matter how much she tried to distance herself from the case, she would always remember it. The image of Daniel's cold, misguided love would remain etched in her mind. And for the rest of her life, she would continue to ask herself the same question she had asked since the moment she first heard about the murders. How does a man, a father, a pastor, destroy the family he was supposed to protect?